So first, I'll summarize what I read. So I read Charlie's. I really liked the beginning, the hook that he used. It was an interesting way of starting it, as he began the introduction with a quote from Xi Jinping. He thereafter described kind of the situation and what the Belt Road Initiative is. Um, yeah, and then he used some uh, statistics and backed it up with sources. Thereafter, he had kind of like a paragraph where he described the realism and its perspective on the international relations, um, which I personally I would kind of integrate it into the text, but it also works. Yeah, so the first real paragraph, he starts off by explaining the economic effects that this has. Um, yeah, and brings up uh, China's overall GDP outweighing the the neighboring countries' GDP growth by the Belt Road Initiative, and therefore draws the conclusion that this doesn't threaten their national security, as uh, they will get the most out of this project. Mm, yeah, and on his in his second paragraph, he talks about. Wait, let me just. Uh, yeah, the ideational effects, which is related to creation of ideas that will increase with China's sharp and soft power. Um, and I really liked that he showed um, both side of the situation, as he first explained that this Belt Road Initiative could have a negative effect on China's cultural influence, as it could potentially lead to a China with a integrated Western kind of view. But he also made a point for his claim, that is that which is that it will lead to a more um, Chinese way of thinking throughout uh, the Belt Road, the actual road, as many of the workers are Chinese, or the majority is Chinese. So their mindset will kind of spread by people, just by them interacting with the locals, I guess. The last point was about the interstate cooperation, and he talked about the fact that the Belt Road Initiative will lead to the world being more kind of globalized and connected to especially China, and this will therefore lead to China having that upper hand in corporations and international affairs. So I thought that the text was really good overall. Uh, I would, this is just extra, but on the last point, it would have been interesting if he made a point which contradicted his argument in order to show contrast. But uh, this is a realist analysis, so I do understand why he didn't do that. Um, yeah, so a point he could have made is like how the world won't be affected by the Belt Road Initiative. Um, I also really liked how he used the source to support his points about especially the sharp power, where he showed a direct example in real world situations where the China's influence on neighboring countries is already showing by the voting in UN, I think. Yeah. Uh, yeah, that was kind of the main points I had. I would also like, I didn't understand one of the sentences he made. He said, the undeveloped nature of the poorer regions offers a greater opportunity for economic growth. The economic development would also decrease economic inequalities in the region, which has been linked to social unrest and increased crime rates. And I want to know how this is related to the bridge. Um, and I would also want him to clarify the as a result of initiative uh, and its increased economic integration, countries such as Pakistan and Laos have the largest expected GDP growth.
Okay,
That
that's 5 minutes, by the way. So you mentioned I have the text right next to me here, so I will just bring that up as well so I can.
undeveloped nature of the poorer regions offers a greater opportunity. Yeah, that one.
And how this might connect to the bridge. So
Yeah.
firstly, the Belt and Road Initiative at large isn't really a bridge. I don't really understand what you meant by that, but the so what the Belt and Road Initiative will do is that it, instead of developing, for example, like Shanghai, which already are large, like mega cities, super cities, or whatever you want to call them, the
Mm.
Belt and Road Initiative will aim to connect the poorer regions of China, the undeveloped regions of China, which are mainly desert, if I remember it correctly, and it will aim to connect these specific regions to Europe, meaning that trade will and different types of corporations and enterprises will establish themselves in these regions rather than in these large megacities where there already is a large GDP and a large
Uh,
economic prosperity.
okay, yeah.
Therefore, and the link, and I therefore justify that the linking and improvement of these poorer regions is in Chinese national interest, as due to my source here, Lindgren, 2019 had
Mm.
stated that economic inequalities in Sweden, in regions in Sweden, had been
Mm.
linked to increased crime rates and increased
Oh,
social unrest,
okay.
which therefore might threaten the stability of the region as a whole.
Mm. Yeah.
Then you also had a problem or a question about, or you also said that I could have had a contradicting point to the last
Yeah.
paragraph. Did you mean that I
That was
should
kind of
maybe
like,
have
yeah.
replaced the entire last paragraph with something else, or do you think? What did you mean by that?
Uh, no, but just as you did in the paragraph before it, you kind of showed both sides of the situation.
Okay.
What two possible outcomes
Okay. Yeah,
that
that's.
contrast each other.
I mean, yeah. Uh, I mean, yes, that would be something I can add probably, considering
Yeah.
that I don't know if the Belt and Road Initiative will really affect Chinese influence to a greater degree, really, because Chinese influence is already very large currently, especially in these multinational organizations, and maybe the connection that I've drawn in my text in for these supranational organizations or multinational organizations like the UN, and that this connection that I drew might not be a cause of the Belt and Road Initiative, but might just be a correlation instead, correlation or causation in
Mm.
that sense. But yeah, so what I want to say is basically that I probably could have written like, although this could be the Belt and Road Initiative might not affect this too much, considering that Chinese influence and Chinese trade is already having a large effect on these multinational organizations.
Mm.
So that is very true.
Yeah. But
Uh,
yeah.
And was there any other? I saw that you added a comment on like that I should have a source for a specific portion, which I do very much agree with. That I should have had a source where you added your comment. Uh,
The BRA also uses a predominantly Chinese workforce. Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Yes. Also, in terms of the definition that I had in the beginning, this was. I asked Mr. Shaw and a couple of peers, because I had a small peer review session prior to this meeting, and
Yeah.
also I also asked Mr. Shaw regarding if I should have a definition of the realism in the beginning to make it easier for people who maybe aren't as well versed in IR theories to still understand the text rather well. So originally, I was planning to do the thing that you stated, and that I should just mix it in the text, which I sort of done already, I think,
Yeah.
as I mentioned which realist aspect each of the goals might contradict or go in accordance with.
Mm.
But overall, I see your comments here, and I do agree with most of them.
Mm.
So to try and describe the general topic and main conclusions of the text, the overall topic of the text were the positive and negative effects of the dictator Pinochet's globalization, and the effects that this globalization has had on Chile. So the first part of the text, I think, shows the positives of globalization and thus Pinochet's rule, really. While the text also draws the conclusion that it was due to globalization that it became one of the largest exporters of copper ore, if I understood it correctly. Something which has also allowed it to enter beneficial trade deals with countries it trades with the most, and also to join like organizations like APEC, the Asian Pacific Economic Corporation. The text then explains like the negative aspects of globalization, and draws the conclusion that globalization and capitalism has perpetuated growing economic inequalities, making the rich richer and the poor poorer, which has led to modern day protests. Then the points that I found probably the most interesting were, firstly, that I really liked your definition of globalism in general, and I think the criticism of it really helped your entire assignment as a whole, as it clearly explained a lot of the aspects of globalization and made it possible for maybe even the people who aren't as well versed in IR to understand what your text was about. So you also explained like the problems with the definition, and that globalization doesn't really have a set definition from any party, and that the definition can change depending on who you ask at times. However, I would have maybe liked this section to be written in your own words, as the quote takes up a large portion of the definition. Secondly, I think the text overall really shows nuance and presentation of the event. It firstly presents the backstory, which makes the rest of the text and context really easy to understand. In other words, it explains like why Chile globalized, this being due to Pinochet's dictatorship. The text later explains and illustrates a lot of positives in terms of the GDP growth and the like, and that it later on explains the negatives of globalization. Similarly, you do not only connect this event as a whole, this historical event, to modern day Chile, but also to countries today that are experiencing different, similar events. Thirdly and lastly, I would like to also give you credit for the use of the image, which I really liked. You used your figure to show the economic growth of Chile compared to Latin America, which I think was really clear and good. Then, in terms of the sources, I was rather confused about discussing the limitations of and value of our sources, as this wasn't really deliberately stated in the assignment that we should do. But besides this, I think that the sources that you used were great and very reliable. I checked most of them using a source reliability checker online, and there was only really one source that, according to the checker, was very unreliable, which I've marked in red in your assignment. I also think they used APA instead of MLA in your source citation, but this was also just, not really a minor error, but you can still understand where you got your sources from, which is the most important thing. Lastly, the sources were also used to introduce theories. This was seen in globalization quote, which was it was also used to like support most of your claims when you actually use the sources. There were some cases in which I think it was rather hard to distinguish where which source you had used, but that's still all right. But then on to like the more, negative aspects. Um, in the text, you sometimes use rather like informal language, which although it does make it easier to read for like everyday readers, it does not really fit in with your topic and the assignment as a whole. However, at times, or also at times, you use like abbreviations, missed periods, which I have tried to mark with red in the text. Additionally, you did not really explain certain like acronyms or write them out fully. For instance, UN, GDP, and VTO, which although I understand that you mean like that I understand what you mean, they could also mean different things, like the World Tourist Organization or the World Tourette's Organization. Secondly, I would have liked for you to focus maybe on fewer points and elaborate on them further. For example, rather than mentioning multiple arguments, for instance, I would have liked you to expand on the relevance of Chile joining the UN and APEC. There's also one sentence that I had a hard time understanding. Chile in the 2020s was almost all 90% of the poorest third of Chileans needed to use brutally underfunded public things. And thirdly, and the lastly point, I know I'm going a bit over time here maybe, is that I would have liked you to structure it a bit more clearly, mainly by having full line spacing instead of the indentations, because it made it rather unclear when you were actually on a new paragraph, which made it rather difficult to distinguish not only the introduction but also the theses.
So you brought up a point about not quite understanding one sentence, and I agree the percentages were kind of messy, and I myself didn't really understand like the exact amount of people who didn't get like the proper healthcare or at least good quality healthcare. But basically, those percentages or whatever is just to prove the point that like the 90% of the poorest third of Chileans had like pretty bad healthcare or still has pretty bad healthcare. And about the beginning of the text, like I know the beginning is kind of messy, and yeah, I'm sorry about that, but like it was pretty hard for me. As you took up, I talked about a lot of different aspects of like how globalization has affected Chile. So it's kind of hard to tie everything together into one like opening like phrase, yeah, or thesis statement. But I think I tie everything together quite nicely at the end, so I think that kind of complements.
Yeah, I was gonna say that too. Your conclusion is very good, I think.
Yeah, thanks. So did you have any other questions?
If you could go over the your use of abbreviations and rather informal language at times, and
Yeah. So personally, I like writing with a little informal language when I can, and try to use the formal language when it's really necessary in the text. Just because I find it easier for myself, and that's just like my level of English, I'd say. So yeah, I mean, I could write it more with more formal language, and that's just how it is. Yeah. And about the MLA, I used a like MLA citation machine, like the one I always use. So I don't know why it ended up as APA.
I was gonna add as well that if you're using citation machine, then it auto defaults to APA instead of MLA after the recent update.
Oh, but yeah, but other than that, I did use the APA format as APA format was supposed to be used. If that makes anything better.
Okay.
What
Maybe if you can maybe add some details about things you could have, because I also said that you could have removed maybe the
quotes.
Yes. How would you go about that? Can you discuss that bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, about the quotes. it's a definition, and like definitions, you can't really like change them up so much because you would lose the actual definition. And I felt that as well, like copying in this like large bit into the text would seem kind of weird. But I felt that it was more necessary to copy a definition in than more like a general idea.
Mm.
So that's my point on that. And yeah, I mean, as you said, it was even more important to copy the definition, I'd say, because globalization is quite, you know, hard to like pinpoint, especially like depending on like what theme you're using it in. So like if you're just talking economics or like sociological or political or whatever.
Mm. And the aspect about, yeah,
Acronyms.
why it joining the UN and APEC is relevant.
I mean, most of the like things Chile has joined overall that I bring up here, uh, all support. I mean, stuff that help with the globalization of Chile. So it's a lot of um, agreements about trade and lowering tariffs and tax.
Okay.
So I mean that's that. So I mean I just read the text and made some points, so this might be a little messy. The paper about Hong Kong's security law. The paper is about Hong Kong's security laws and how it is threatening the one country two system, the one country two systems system through China's recent security law. Basically, I mean that's a really short summary. And While reading the text, I found a lot of good like summaries, like or I mean examples of how mainland China has started to like try to take more and more control over Hong Kong, like going high incidents and the assimilation to China would lead to Hong Kong's downfall as a massive financial center. Because that's what really, as you said in the text, makes Hong Kong, more protected. That it had such a high GDP. It had 1/4 in the late 90s. Hong Kong produced 1/4 of like China's money, and you brought up different perspectives that you know wrote out quite clearly in the text. Like for example, the realist perspective was used quite nicely around the middle, and you had good points about China becoming more and more powerful, uh, and again, Hong Kong becoming less and less significant to them, so that they feel that they can take over. Um, you could have. This is not really uh, that important, but you could have brought up Shenzhen as China's main center for technology production and connect it in some way to the lowered tariffs between the U.S. and Hong Kong. But that's because that was something you talked about, and you talked about Shenzhen becoming a larger, um, you know, a city in China overall. So I would just like, I don't know, it would fit quite nicely, I'd say. And you had good examples of a sharp power, like China using a you had good examples of hard power that China is using against Hong Kong, like for example the censoring in school books and the violence against protesters. And personally, uh, I I've heard some things about China as well, and I think you could have brought up something that I heard just on the Swedish radio about this about the Communist Party not allowing any parties, to run in the Chinese democracy if they don't support the security law, which is another example of shark power. I'd say the structure was a little confusing, at least for me, but that's more on the English grading side, so don't need to worry about that as much. Um, at times it might have been a little unclear, but that might just be because of my English level. Um, and you named a lot of big names, like the WHO and such, which you know is really good to do in a text, I'd say, because people already know and trust those big sources. And you really made a good efforts to focus on the one thing. You didn't, um, start. Oh, I don't remember the word, but you really focused on only China and Hong Kong and the conflict between those two. And I mean, basically that's it. Overall, it was a really good text, I'd say. Um, it was just some comments about the clarity, and other than that, yeah, good job, I'd say.
Thank you. So, um, what you said that I need. You said that I could add something about China's control in government or in running for government or something like that. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so I heard on the Swedish radio that
Mm.
the CCP are not allowing other parties to run. I mean, in their quote unquote democracy.
Do you
If
mean in Hong Kong or in mainland China?
I think this is Hong Kong
Because
specifically Hong
Hong
Kong.
Kong has they have their own council kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's that. And also, I would like to add just one last thing. Most of your sources that I could find some
Hmm.
information about on like fact checks were either left biased or left center biased.
Hmm.
So I mean,
Oh,
that's
about
just
that.
something to think about.
I checked on a bias and reliability scorer, and most of these scored. For example, first of all, the New York Times, they scored a 47 in reliability, and 32 is seen as good. So I think that makes up for it. And then in bias, it scored -4, and here it says that bias scorer for articles shows are on a scale, a -42 to +42, and the closer to the zero you are, the more reliable you are. So I think it's pretty reliable in that
Yeah,
sense.
I mean
And
it's
I also think that it's almost impossible to find any source that isn't biased in some way.
yeah,
And I also checked um, bias or Forbes top news sources for least biased information, and New York Times was number one in that. And for the Vox, I didn't use any objective information from the Vox source. I
okay,
only
yeah,
uh, the that China accounted for a quarter, or Hong Kong accounted for a quarter of China's total GDP.
okay. I mean that that does make it better, and even I mean the checker I used said it was very little bias. So I mean the
Mm.
sources are good.
Mm.
Uh, so
Yeah.
yeah.
You also said that I could add something else in the beginning. I think you said something.
I mean Shenzhen is, uh, you know, you could say like the technological center of China, uh,
Mhm.
and Hong Kong has lower tariffs on technology between the U.S. and Hong Kong. So
Mm.
it was just a like small suggestion. It doesn't make it worse or anything, but it would be nice if you could tie that in some way. Like for example, that the mainland China would like that tariff to rather go to Shenzhen than Hong Kong.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that could be something I could have added. But I also wanted the text not to be too long. So, but I do understand your point.
yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I don't have much to comment on.